Good morning, and welcome to the Paul Green Comedy PaulCast. It is March 27th, 2024. This is episode 119 of the podcast. Here, a podcast by a dreamer for dreamers out there as I document my journey as a stand-up comedian and actor, seeking gigantic success in an industry that is very difficult, at least for me, to navigate and predict and to strategize on how to achieve said success. And so that's what I'm up to, and that's what I am documenting. So yesterday, if you followed the podcast, you know that I had a call scheduled with a friend of mine from high school, one of my close friends, who is now doing executive coaching and teaching, or I don't know about teaching, but I guess there's a teaching element. And I had mentioned that I am struggling to, first of all, figure out what to do material-wise. Everything that I've been trying to do in terms of new stand-up material hasn't been going well for a bit of a patch, a longer patch of time than I've ever had a struggle before trying to come up with new material. And then just sort of my concerns overall with what I'm up to and how I'm trying to find a way to achieve my goals and my dreams in this industry. So he said, hey, I'd love to talk to you about that. And so anyway, so we had a Zoom meeting yesterday, and I just started talking through what I'm thinking, how I'm processing things. And really what the conversation gravitated towards was and is, what are my assumptions about myself, assumptions about what it is that I'm up to, assumptions about what success and victory might look like for me, and a consistent analogy kept surfacing, which is the idea of winning the lottery. And so I kept discussing how I don't know how much of my success is contingent upon some sort of luck, a big lucky break. Everybody talks about getting the big break, versus how much of it can I actually just work and build for myself. Or how much does my input, my work ethic, have to do with accomplishing this goal. I mean, everybody says, well, you got to work hard. You got to grind. I don't get a lot of discussion or hear a lot more in depth than that. We'll work hard and grind. But I don't hear a lot of, well, what does the work look like? And what does the grind look like? And what is the most effective way to work, or the most effective avenues to put your work? And I've heard all kinds of theories and philosophies. There's kind of the camps of, it's just like, just put your head down and hone the craft. Just write and write and write and get as best at comedy as you can. And then once you do that, then eventually something will happen. Somebody will discover you, somebody will whatever. Then there's kind of the social media people where, like, you got to advertise, you got to market yourself, you got to be putting yourself on social media. Then there's sort of the networking type things, like, we got to network, you got to show up everywhere, you got to kiss a lot of ass. It's not about what you know, it's who you know. So go try to get to know as many people as possible. And then there's also an element of like, well, if you just got to be lucky. So anyway, his challenge to me was to just start analyzing my assumptions, both historically, like how much of my life right now that I do consider lucky or fortunate actually was luck, and how much of it actually was based off of some sort of input, some sort of work ethic on or actions or behaviors that I had taken, and how much of it was clearly just sort of a out of the blue lottery ticket. So I started doing that last night, pulled out the old journal and started journaling. And I mean, I still don't know. I don't know how much of my life is a result of my actions and how much of it is a result of factors outside of my control that happen to line up for my benefit. So that'll be a fun challenge, for me, a fun mental exercise for me to really dive into my assumptions about myself, about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and how much of that is actually a direct result of the strings I'm pulling, and how much are there strings being pulled by other forces or entities beyond my control that are either working for me or against me. So I don't know, but this idea of a lottery ticket is actually, it surfaced very powerfully over the last 24 hours when he initially said, hey, let's have a conversation. But that's actually not a new concept for me. I actually remember I was in a play when I first moved to LA. A Shakespeare play. And I remember talking with one of the other actors, and we were talking about making it or getting famous, being one of those actors that is able to actually exist solely as an actor. They have that much success, which is actually very, very rare to be able to make a living, really, as any artist. For every Taylor Swift who is making hundreds of millions of dollars as a singer-songwriter, there are probably 100,000 or so. I don't know what the number is, but there are a lot more not Taylor Swifts in terms of, pop, female singer, songwriter, guitar players, entertainers who are right now at a coffee shop singing their songs about breakups to about 4 people half paying attention who are doing homework with, and she's got a tip jar there, and is pouring her heart into her music just as much as Taylor Swift. There are a lot more of those. And that's the same thing with actors, with comedians, the actual comedians and actors who are, well, again, maybe these are all assumptions. I don't know what the actual numbers are, but this is just my experience. Let me just put it this way. Since I've been doing stand-up comedy, I've met probably 1,000 comics, maybe. I feel like I've met it probably around at least 1,000. I mean, just in the time that I've been doing it, I remember signing up. First time I ever did a stand-up comedy class, there was 15 other comics in that class. I remember the first time I did an open mic, there were 25 other comics on that open mic who I'd never seen or heard before. And then I moved to LA, and I would do open mic after open mic after open mic, and would meet another dozen here, another 10 here, another 15 here, of just comic after comic after comic, comics who I've never heard of, never seen. Some of them I've never seen since. Now, obviously, in LA, you start to get a little bit of sense of the boundaries, the community. You start showing up to open mics. You maybe start seeing a handful of the same people over and over and over again. But I mean, just hundreds and hundreds of comics that I've just met just in the few markets that I've even explored in, which is like the Phoenix market and the LA market. And even when I would travel, it would be like, oh, now I go to Washington. And then it's like, oh, well, there's some comics up there who are opening or featuring who I've never heard of. And like that's Seattle. And then I would go to comedy festivals in Vegas and meet 50 more comics who I've never heard of. Then I'd go to Florida to a festival and meet another 10 comics I've never heard of. And, I've been to Atlanta and met a bunch of comics. And I remember going to an open mic at the Improv in Houston, and I'd never been to Texas before. 30 new comics in Houston who I've never heard of before. I went to an open mic once in Mobile, Alabama, in the attic of a bar, and there were 15 comics in there from Alabama who I'd never heard of, never seen of. Got to do a little bit of comedy with there. I remember going when I went to New York just about 4 or 5 months ago. I went to 3 different comedy shows there. One at the Comedy Cellar, where I saw maybe 6 comics, New York comics who I'd never heard of. I went to the other Comedy Cellar show, so another 4 or 5 comics who I'd never seen or never heard of before, except when Amy Schumer showed up and closed out the show. I heard of Amy Schumer. And then I had a buddy who was on this small little indie show around the corner from the Comedy Cellar, and I saw about 4 or 5 other New York comics there at like 1 a.m, doing comedy. And that was just like one night, 3 different clubs in New York, or maybe over 2 nights. And that's just comics who I have some way or the other have just even seen. Not to mention all of the comics who pop up on my Instagram, pop up on my TikTok, who I've never ever heard of, who are putting their stand-up comedy clips, and different levels of fame. Sometimes a comic I've never heard of will pop up on my TikTok, and they're performing at a theater in front of like 2,000 people. I'm like, who the heck is this guy? And how do 2,000 people know who this guy is and know how to buy tickets? Because that's what I'm trying to do. Like, I'm fine, I'm fine not being a household name, but if I have enough fame, like whoever this person is, to even have an audience of that size. Now, who knows how much of that is, oh, well, is he doing that every night? I mean, I have a video where it looks like I'm performing in front of an audience of thousands, although it's an audience of 200, that I did once, and then I spent thousands of dollars to even produce. So then it's like the Dry Bar, if you know the Dry Bar up in Provo, I get a lot of their clips, just a new batch of comics popping up on my TikTok feed, comic after comic after comic after comic after comic. Like, that's just comedy. That's just stand-up comedy. And just what I've experienced in terms of the sheer volume of human beings who call themselves stand-up comedians, who are stand-up comedians. That sounded a little condescending. They call themselves stand-up comedians, but are they really? It's like, no, they are. They're stand-up comedians. They have worked on a craft. They have honed a craft. They've written material. They've done whatever grind or whatever they've had to do to get to whatever level they're at, to get a video online that shows up on my social media feed, because obviously social media knows that the algorithm knows that, oh, we should put comedians in front of Paul because he seems to watch those for longer than he watches other stuff. So what does all that mean? What does all that mean? Why did I bring all that up? It's, again, just an indication of the sheer volume of competition. It's like, well, there's no competition but yourself. Yeah, sure. Okay, great. But it just goes back to what got me on this little tangent here, which is just how hard it is to actually make a living when it's that saturated of an industry. And again, that's just stand-up comedy, but it's the same thing for acting. When I was in LA, it's just the tens of thousands of actors who are all trying to be successful, get a role that gives them visibility, that gives them, a resume to where the industry starts to go like, oh, we need to get that actor is crushing it and they can actually make enough money to survive, which is not easy. So these are all of the assumptions that's swimming around in my head right now that I'm contending with and trying to grapple with how much of my current situation is because of these assumptions and how much of those assumptions are actually either incorrect or maybe not accurate or are maybe hindering me from having a different experience and a different outcome if I had different assumptions, and if those different assumptions influenced my behavior, which how could they not? The whole, how much of my subconscious is driving the bus, and is my subconscious, do they know actually how to drive the bus, and are they driving the bus in the right direction? So, a lot to think about. Yeah. And there's just so much unknown in this, but I think that is... But I think that's the payoff. It's like, well, what's the other option? We'll go live a life that's known. Go live a life that has a deep enough rut because enough human beings have done that same path more or less and have sort of created the pathway. Well, if you want to be an accountant, here is the pathway. There's not a lot of ambiguity. There's not a lot of unknown in that pathway. Well, you want to be an accountant, you go to school, you do well in math, you get into a college and you major in accounting, and then you graduate, and then you go get your, master's, you go get your CPA certification, and then you start accounting. You start saying, hey, people, you want some accounting done? I can do that for you. But maybe that's an assumption. Oh. Maybe there is a path that's just as clearly defined for success, but for some reason, I assume it's something different. You are watching Paul Green challenge his own psyche live. And by live, I mean recorded on the Paul Green Comedy PaulCast. But that's where I'm at. That's what I'm grappling with right now. And we'll see how the next couple of days. So I'm, again, my challenge was to look at all those assumptions, see if I can challenge them, maybe poke holes in them, and see if there are some other assumptions that are maybe more empowering. Well, I can answer that question. It's like, oh, there definitely are. There are definitely more powerful, more effective assumptions that I think will help me on my path here. So that's what I'm up to. Later today, also, I will be heading over to my good buddy Josh Novi's house, who was on the podcast last week, because he and I are going to start another podcast. Because if there's one thing the world needs, it's more Paul Green on the internet, talking about stuff into a microphone. Cool, everybody. Thank you so much for listening. I hope that as you are starting to challenge maybe your assumptions about what it'll take to get your dreams, maybe this was helpful. Maybe we can all dive in and do that together. Let's just look at the subconscious assumptions that are driving our bus, and maybe just take an opportunity to look at those and see if we like the direction the bus is going. So, that is all for today. This is March 27, 2024, episode 119 of the Paul Green Comedy PaulCast. I hope you're all doing well. I love you all so much. Thank you for listening, and I will talk to you tomorrow.